It's my great pleasure today to introduce Tori Timmins. Those of you who have been following our quarterly newsletter know that I've written a lot about Tori recently. She's been working with us here at the Historical Society since, I think, September of 2020. So Tori is a Guilford native and a graduate of Rutgers University with a degree in costume design and technology. Last year, I think around in July or August, she wrote to us saying that she was interested in doing kind of like a self-guided, self-directed internship. And she was reaching out to a couple of local historical societies to examine their textile collections. And so she began here in September and quickly realized that our collection was the one that had the most depth, maybe even the most well-preserved, and just offered her the most in terms of exploring and discovering lots of interesting objects. So she has a process which she will explain in great depth, but basically, as I understand it, it has involved examining the objects, then making hand-drawn patterns, and then she takes those and she puts those into a program. And this, in my mind, is a form of cultural preservation because, as you can imagine, textiles just naturally degrade over time. So we've been so thrilled to have Tori with us. We are going to be sad to lose her in the fall when she moves on to NYU to get her master's degree in costume design. But it's my privilege and pleasure to introduce Tori. So without further ado, Tori's going to come around. Alrighty. So one other thing I was going to mention is that at some point I will take the camera off and I will walk over to these beautiful garments behind me. So if there's a little judder of the camera, I'll try to hold it as still as I can. But we will move the camera around at some point. Okay, here comes Tori.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tori. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. And yeah, today I'm going to be starting the first part of our three-part lecture series here over the next couple months, examining a couple different objects from the Madison Historical Society. So as Jenny so kindly said, I've been here for the past little less than a year, conducting research, doing pattern documentation, looking at different objects in the collections here, ranging from around 1810 to 1910 in particular, and documenting them with the intention of using those patterns for garment reconstruction and, historical reconstruction for educational and practical purposes like theater, film, television, reenactment, stuff like that. So that's kind of the research that I've been doing here while working at the Historical Society. However, I was very excited when it was proposed to me that we do this kind of lecture series featuring objects in the collection that I perhaps didn't get the chance to examine or pattern or document, and just are really unique pieces that we can all take a look at together and that might not be seen, on the day-to-day if someone's coming and visiting the Historical Society. So in order to do that, essentially what I'm going to be doing today is, since this is the first of our three-part series, we're going to be looking at pieces from the collection from the 18th century. Most of our collections, our textile collections, start around 1775. So that might be a little confusing because you might be wondering, how are we going to look at 18th century textiles if they're starting kind of in the last quarter of the 18th century? And so what I've decided to do is we're going to be starting in 1775, which I'm sure many of you know is right around the start of the Revolutionary War, which attributes to why we have so many kind of pieces from that time period in particular. And we're going to be moving through around 1825. I have kind of been taught during my experience working with historical garments and learning about kind of these aesthetics of any time period that the dress of a century doesn't tend to really truly define itself until about 20 years into that century. So a lot of the kind of dress and textiles that we're going to be looking at that are from the early 19th century are still kind of playing into some of the design choices and ideologies of the 18th century. So just kind of to give an overall explanation, we're going to be looking at mostly objects from 1775 to 1825. Before I get started, I just wanted to send in chat. I have a link to, I just typed up a document with a couple of vocabulary terms and like definitions that I'm going to be using during this presentation. If you want to pull that up and look at it while I'm presenting, feel free. If not, that's totally fine and it's not necessary whatsoever. So let me just send that right now. So I just sent that in the chat. If you feel like looking at it while I'm presenting, you're more than welcome to. If not, that's totally fine as well. So we are going to be looking at objects in our collection, but I wanted to make sure you all had a really well-rounded, full understanding of what people were wearing during this time period, not just featuring objects from our collections. So to do that, I ended up picking some images from a bunch of different historical societies, museums, and collections that feature garments from kind of the colonial era that we might not have here in our collections, but I think are important to kind of understand the world that we're living in and the pieces that we're looking at. So we're going to get started, and the first kind of time period we're looking at is around 1775 to 1785. So I have my images here, and I'll be holding them up so we can look at them. So I think the first thing to note is kind of what the silhouette of that time period was. Around 1775, we're coming to the end of the Rococo era. So if any of you guys kind of know general fashion history, the Rococo era is kind of characterized by a very famous figure, especially in France, Marie Antoinette. And you guys can kind of all imagine her with her very big peignets on the side and very big hair. And while that was definitely not the case here in the States, it was a very popular style of dress in Europe. And towards the tail end of that period, so around the 1770s, everything was starting to deflate. So the understructures from that time period, which we can see here, would be something along the lines of this. So this is a pair of stays. This is from the Philadelphia Museum. And as you guys can see, this pair of stays is very conical shaped. So you're kind of creating this upside down V silhouette. You guys see okay? All right.
Yeah, it's a lot better.
And then it's full of rows of stitching, which have inside it pieces of baleen. And baleen is a type of whalebone. Not whalebone, it's historically called whalebone. However, it is actually whale teeth. So it's basically the filters that are in kind of a whale's mouth. And when people would, kill whales to use for oil, they would take the baleen and they would use them in things such as corsets. They would also use them in umbrellas. And they're very stiff. So this garment is incredibly structured. And the idea is that, hold it down a little bit. Oops. Yeah, that's better. There we go. The idea is that we're creating this kind of conical shape. And then in addition to this kind of pair of stays, we would be wearing something along the lines of this, which is a pair of peignets, they're called. I'll make sure you guys can see. All right. So a pair of peignets are kind of like these little pocket hips. And the goal of the silhouette of this time period was to create a look where it was wide on the sides and then flat in the front and flat, for the most part, in the back. And there were two styles of dress that we would find people wearing predominantly during the kind of 1770s through 1780s. And those two styles of dress can be characterized as the robe à la anglaise and the robe à la française. And so we're going to look at a couple examples, again, from the Philadelphia Museum. This is a robe à la anglaise. And as you can see, it's got the very conical shape of the bodice. And then it's got the side puffs that aren't quite as big as that kind of Marie Antoinette style that the era was known for before this kind of period. However, we've still got that kind of side puff and then flat in the front and the cone shape of the bodice. The robe à la anglaise, however, is characterized by the fact that it is flat in the back. So as you can see in these two images, oops, the back is flat. So it's fitted to the bodice, to the body. Whereas the robe à la française, which is another very popular style from the time period, has something called watteau pleats down the back. And the watteau pleats are these two pleats that kind of rise off the back of the body and run down the back of the dress. And essentially, other than those pleats, those two styles of dress are very, very similar to each other, except their characteristics diverge kind of by the way the back of the dress sits. So obviously, we were an English colony. So the predominant style here in the States would have been that English style of dress, the robe à l'anglaise, especially for day wear. So kind of when we're wearing day dresses and for day-to-day looks. That being said, the robe à la française was found in evening wear dresses, in the case of this blue one here. which is at the Philadelphia Museum and belonged to the wife of a prominent lawyer in Philadelphia at the time. And it's kind of interesting to think about how this kind of dress might have been a political statement during this time, because as we all know, this is kind of the era of the Revolutionary War. And it's just interesting to think about what it means for the wife of a lawyer to be going to a ball wearing a very French style of dress as opposed to an English style of dress. It's definitely making a statement. So that's kind of the women's style of dress from that time period. Now we're going to take a moment to look at our first object from the collection, which is a really, really special object. It's very beautiful, and it's one of the oldest pieces of clothing in our collection. And it's this waistcoat and shirt, which belonged to Colonel William Prescott. So Jenny's just going to take the camera and bring it over here so we can take a closer look. So this is a waistcoat. It belonged to Colonel William Prescott, who was a colonel during the American Revolutionary War. He fought in the Battle of Bunker Hill. And he's actually very well known for a quote that he said, which is, "Don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes," which I'm sure many of you have heard, but you might not know it's attributed to him. And he's actually from Massachusetts, but we're very lucky to have this piece in our collection. And if we look up close, all down the front is this beautiful hand embroidery. So it's important to note that all the clothes that we're looking at today would have been made during a time period before the sewing machine was invented in the 1840s. And so everything had to be constructed by hand. And it's a little difficult to see on camera, but if we look at the stitching on places like the cuff here, it's very, very, very small. And many people look at garments like this and they go, there's no way that could be made by hand. There's absolutely no way. But it was. People just, first of all, had a lot of time to dedicate to creating garments such as these, and took a lot of pride in their work in creating things that were really beautiful and, delicate and hand stitched. Down the front, we have this kind of ascot style ruffle, and this actually would have been starched during the time period. So if I touch it now, it's still got a bit of stiffness to it, but every time they would have washed a linen undershirt like this, they would have restarched the ruff, which is interesting to consider because you want to think about how it kind of stood and was structured as opposed to being just kind of a flowy, very like artsy, romantic looking linen that you might imagine from the time period. It was very structured, and it definitely had depth to it. So this is kind of the silhouette of the men's ensemble from the time period. Here we have an example from the Met of, I will just show you quickly what kind of pants might have been worn with an ensemble like this. They have a drop crotch button down kind of down the front. And they lace up the sides, and they would have been worn with a pair of stockings and then shoes or boots. And actually, it's a little difficult to see, but there's a little initials embroidered on this one, which was very common, especially for linens or clothes that might look very similar to other people's, such as this pair of breeches. People would embroider, usually in red, or in the case of on like a shirt like this, they might have done it in white, the initials of whoever was wearing it, just so it didn't get mixed up in the wash or anything like that. Okay, so kind of the style that finished out the 18th century was very similar to what we've kind of looked at already. However, two very notable things happened. One was the understructure shifted from panniers, which were kind of those little side pockets and trying to create a like flat in the front and the back, big on the side silhouette, to something more along the lines of this. This is a pair of hoops from the Colonial Williamsburg collection. And basically, we're still kind of getting that width on the side, but we're more evenly distributing it around the sides and back of the dress. And so the silhouette became a bit more rounded and a bit less kind of ovular in the sense of the kind of gowns we were looking at earlier. Additionally, we were starting to make our way towards this kind of boom in the neoclassical silhouette. And we saw the waistline rise up significantly. So we've still kind of got that conical silhouette. This is a dress that belonged to Martha Washington and is currently housed at Mount Vernon. However, as you can see, the waistline has gone from relatively low to bumped up a couple inches. It's still got that cone shape, but it is higher. And then this is just a bodice, again, belonging to Martha Washington. And there's no skirt attached to this, but it does kind of show that similar look that we were talking about. So that is kind of how we rounded out the 18th century. Now, as we moved into the 19th century, something very important happened kind of in this fashion journey that we're looking at. And that was actually the direct result of something which I'm not sure if you guys have heard of, but it was called a grand tour. And grand tours were very popular amongst specifically very wealthy young men. And it was kind of the, old-timey equivalent to a college student taking a gap year and going backpacking across Europe. Basically, very wealthy European men and sometimes very wealthy American men would travel to Europe, take time and just try to immerse themselves in the culture of Europe and learn about kind of their history. And essentially what they would do is they would travel around Europe, and a lot of these young men ended up going to places like Italy and Greece. They would travel to Rome, and they started discovering kind of the classical world. And we saw this big shift into interest in neoclassical architecture and neoclassical design, and eventually into kind of neoclassical fashion. So if you want to think about this, this is following kind of the Revolutionary War. If you guys want to think about neoclassical design, just think about, DC, our capital. It's almost all kind of done in this very, neoclassical aesthetic with these big columns and white buildings. So we started seeing that being reflected in fashion as well. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that these men would go on these tours, they would go travel to Europe, they would go to Greece, they would go to Italy, and there wasn't really the same kind of restrictions about taking things that there are nowadays. So it was very common for people to just, come across a statue or come across a bust and decide, I'm going to take this home. I'm going to bring this back to, our estate in England. I'm going to take this back to, our home in the colonies, and we're going to, show it off, and it's going to be, beautiful. It's going to be featured in our house. And as a result of that, we started seeing fashion that reflected the look of these robes, of these chitons, of these different kind of Roman and Grecian inspired women. And it was kind of seen in the fashion that we were looking at. So these are two examples from the Met of gowns from around 1800 to 1815. They're two different style gowns, or two different, oops, which way am I going? There we go. They're two different types of gown, or two different gowns. However, they are very similar in design, as they have both feature an empire waistline, which is a very high waistline, and they're both completely white. Which was very, very, very popular during this time period. And also they were very focused on kind of catering to a more natural silhouette. So they no longer wanted to be wearing gowns that looked very structured and conical. They wanted to be wearing gowns that looked very natural, that featured the body, and they were very long and thin. And so when we think about understructures, we saw those three examples of understructures that were being worn kind of in the 25 years or so prior to this era. And we want to see how that shift happened. And we have a wonderful example over here, I'm going to bring over to you guys, of an understructure from around this time period. This is a corded corset. So I'm going to hold it up for you guys. You all see? Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So this is a corded corset. So it's important to keep in mind when we look at that pair of stays, right, that we saw earlier, that pair of stays was very, very structured. It was very conical. If I tried to bend this around or fold it or anything along those lines, it wouldn't move. Its intention was to kind of sculpt the body into something very sharp and defined. Whereas this pair of stays, and I say pair of stays kind of in the same way you would say pair of pants. It's one garment, however, you refer to it in two parts. So this pair of stays is actually kind of bordering on the time period when we were moving into referring to things as corsets. However, this pair of stays features rope boning instead of kind of that bents or baleen. So I can kind of fold it around and fold it and move it and sculpt it to kind of fit the body, fit the natural form, more along the lines of what we were trying to achieve during that neoclassical silhouette, neoclassical era. So this is made of cotton. If I turn it around, oops, you can see it's got eyelets down the back, which are made from ivory, and it would be laced up. Another thing to note is the waistline, which is right here. So it's much higher than that pair of stays that we were looking at earlier. So this is a really wonderful piece in our collection. I was very excited when I found it. I actually found it in a drawer with like linens, so with like some bed sheets and stuff. And I came across it and I was very excited. So we got the chance to take a look at that. Next, we're going to just move into the last kind of era of clothing history from around 1815 to 1825 with this beautiful gown that we've got over here. So this is an absolutely gorgeous gown in our collection. It's personally one of my favorite pieces, and it's dated from around 1825. Oops. So as you can see, it's still got kind of the little leftover bits of that high waistline, even though, 10 years beforehand, it would have been much higher. It's still got the straight waistline. Next week, we're going to be doing our lecture on the Victorian era, and we're going to see this waistline turn into something much sharper and more pointed. Or not next week, next month. However, right now, we're still seeing the remnants of kind of that pure waist, neoclassical silhouette. As you can all see as well, it is a white gown. So that is also kind of taking inspiration from that Roman, Grecian kind of era. A notable difference, though, is that we're seeing more decorative kind of separate pieces. During the years prior, most decoration would come in the form of kind of fabric manipulation, really subtle embroidery, or kind of, as we can see on pieces like the sleeve here, very small piping along the edges, as opposed to, beading, feathers, more elaborate kind of jewelry that we were seeing in the time period beforehand. So we have this beautiful Van Dyke collar, which goes around the sides and is very characteristic of kind of the 1820s. If we go around the back, we can see it ties up the back as opposed to having a lacing or eyelets or closures. And then it's got this really beautiful kind of curved back pattern piece, which is very, very common in the kind of 1820s and stays very popular through kind of the 1840s, 1850s. So we'll be talking about it a lot during our Victorian lecture as well. And the way that the skirt on this would have been made is actually through taking full widths of fabric. So essentially fabric only came in widths that were so wide because of the fact that we weren't really industrializing fabric production yet. We weren't getting like yardage of fabrics like you might get at Joann's nowadays. So we would get widths of fabric, probably about that wide. You would stitch them together kind of in panels, and then it was pleated straight down into kind of this waistband here with a flat front down the center, the flat pleat down the center front that's kind of wider. So yeah, this is a really beautiful piece. This is one of my favorite garments in the collection and is one of the garments featured in the kind of pattern documentation that I'm doing during my personal research. So during the kind of early part of the 1800s, we were going for that very column-esque silhouette. And as we move into the Victorian era, the skirts are going to start getting wider. And next week, when we talk about kind of the Victorian era more extensively, I'm sure you all know the kind of Civil War era silhouette. The skirts get very, very, very big. And we start seeing cage crinolines and understructures just to accommodate these big skirts. So this dress right here, which is kind of right before the Victorian era starts and really truly begins, would have had something underneath it akin to this petticoat, which I'm going to try and feature as best that I can, so you guys can all see it. So this is a type of petticoat. It's called it's a roped petticoat. And this is actually very special. I've only seen two other examples, like extant examples of garments like this in museums. There's one at the Boston MFA, and there's one at the Met. And essentially what it does is it's a standard petticoat, except they've taken cording or rope or cording and stitched it around the base. So I want you to try and imagine, essentially, when this was first made, it had stiff rope in it. So I hope you guys can see that well enough. It had really stiff rope in it, meaning that when you put it on, it almost stood out from the body, like kind of like a hula hoop, not, to the structural extent of the hoop skirts that we will see later in the 1800s. However, it did kind of create this bell shape, which, if you can imagine, underneath a dress like this, would kind of let the skirt pop out a little bit more, which we weren't seeing at the beginning of the 1800s, but we did begin to see kind of into the 1820s as kind of our time period we're looking at now begins to wrap up. So those are kind of the full garments that we're going to be looking at today. And now I want to move a bit into kind of some fun accessories and stuff that we have here at the Historical Society in our collection. So I should have addressed this earlier, but I just want to mention it now. When I'm working with textiles and constructed garments, I don't use gloves. That's how I was trained to do it. And it has to do with the fact that we want to avoid any chance of accidentally snagging things, buttons. You know, these garments are very delicate, so I don't want to accidentally pull something because I'm wearing gloves. However, as I'm going to move into some jewelry pieces, some shoes right now, and some hats, anything that has metal on it, I do put gloves on for because we want to avoid any fingerprints or anything like that. So I'm going to put my gloves on now, and we're going to move into accessories. So the first accessories that we're going to look at are shoes. And so we're going to travel back a little bit more to around kind of that later half of the 18th century, 1770s, and we're going to look at our first pair of shoes. And we have two pairs of shoes that are from around this time period. So I hope you guys can all see. So these shoes are called Louis shoes or Louis heel shoes. And it has to do with the King of France and the fact that the shoes essentially flare out at the bottom. And so these are very identifiable shoes and would have been worn by both men and women. The two pairs that we're looking at today belonged to women. However, it was very common for men to wear heels during the time. So I will show you both of these shoes very quickly so you guys can see them. Everyone see okay? And these are very special. These are some of the oldest pieces that we have in our collection here. These shoes in particular. And then we have another pair of Louis heels, which are white. However, they're from a little bit later, probably the 1780s. And you can tell they're getting a bit rounder, but they still have that Louis heel. So kind of fun thing to take note of when we're looking at shoes like this from this time period is I will actually let you guys each look and take a minute and see if you can guess what it is. I know we don't have our sound on, but you can all take a look and try and guess what I'm about to say. Shoes during this time and up until around the 1820s were not made for the individual foot. So both of these shoes could be worn on either foot, which is very interesting and kind of a good fun fact if you ever need one. But they were made kind of to be worn and switched between both feet. So if you look at the bottom of the shoes, there's no defining characteristics that would make it, you know, a shoe for your left foot or a shoe for your right foot. And we really didn't see that until the 1820s. So all of the shoes that we're looking at today actually fall into that category of, you know, they would be made for one foot or the other. And the last thing I kind of wanted to note with this shoe in particular, which I'm not sure if you guys can see, but I want to bring up close, is if you see right there, there's a little pin in it. And I want to talk a little bit about closures during kind of this time period, because the zipper was not invented until 1854. Yes, 1854 is when the zipper was invented. So before that, we had to come up with different ways to keep things closed. And we've seen a couple examples so far. On the dress back here, we saw ties. On the front of the waistcoat, we saw buttons. On the corset that we looked at, we saw a lace-up back. And in this case, we're seeing a pin, which I think is very interesting because I'm someone who comes from a background in theater design and working with a lot of actors. And if you tried to put a straight pin in a costume for an actor nowadays, they would not have it. They would not be happy with that. However, up until kind of the end of the 1800s, it was very, very common for people to use straight pins as a way of closing garments, which we can see here on this shoe. So when I was actually working in London and was working with garments that were much older, kind of in the 16th, 17th century, there was more than one occasion where we would open something up and we'd find a pin on the inside because people use them for everything. Just whenever they need to close something, they use a pin, and not a safety pin, just a straight pin. So as you guys can see, that's kind of a little fun fact. Our next pair of shoes that we're going to be looking at are from the early 1800s, so right around the turn of the century. And once again, we're talking about that neoclassical silhouette. We're trying to find something that's very natural. We're trying to be very romantic and one with the earth and all that kind of thing. And so there was a huge boom in popularity of ballet flats, which, as you guys can see here, if I lift them up again on the bottom, there's no defining foot. They're made for either foot, and then they would lace up on the top. So these were very, very popular. They were kind of just the standard shoe for the time period. And then we have one more shoe that's from a little bit later, probably around 1815. And it's again kind of going for that ballet flat look. However, these are probably more winter shoes, kind of closed covered. And if you look at the side, we can see how they decided to close this shoe as well. An important note, actually, if we're going to look at the lacing on this shoe in particular, is that it's spiral laced. So it's laced kind of around as opposed to laced crosswise. So the kind of go-to way, if you're ever watching a historical drama or a historical, film or theatrical performance, anything like that, the go-to way to tell if the costume designer for that film knows what they're doing or not is whether or not the lacing is spiral laced or cross laced, because we didn't see cross lacing until the very, very end of the Victorian era. So almost everything historically would have been laced around. And that has to do with the fact that people weren't lacing things with the intention of having them fit tightly. They were lacing them with the intention of having them, fit the body naturally. There's this kind of misconception, especially when it comes to corsets and stays, that we were trying to squeeze ourselves into them and make everyone really, really tiny. And that is so far from the case. It was basically people wore corsets kind of similarly to how you would wear a bra nowadays. You want it to fit you. It's not that you're trying to get into the smallest size that you can. In the kind of late Victorian era, we did see a couple people do tight lacing, but that was a very limited and kind of controlled thing that kind of only applied to a small group of people as opposed to all throughout history. So those are our shoes that we're looking at. Our next little accessory that I wanted to look at is something very special that I found in our jewelry collection. And this is actually one of my favorite objects that we're going to look at today. It is called, oh my gosh, I cannot pronounce it, a Chantilly. It's in our definitions list. You guys can see. It is essentially a very, very old-fashioned keychain. So similarly to how nowadays we have all of our keys on a lanyard or whatever, this is just kind of a little accessories chain that were very popular during the beginning of the 18th century and then persisted throughout the 18th century. So we have another example of one of these that we're going to be showing during our Victorian era lecture next month. So on here we have a little cap to what would have been a pair of scissors. We have what would have been a little mirror pocket, except the mirror is unfortunately no longer in it. We have a little perfume holder, a little pin holder, and then my personal favorite piece is right here. Oops, if you guys can see. If I can get it open. If I slide it. Can you guys see okay? There we go. So this little thing here is called a dance card. I don't know if any of you have been watching Netflix, seeing the recent historical drama Bridgerton, but these are featured in it a couple times in the show, which I was very excited about. And essentially what it is it's a card that if you went to a ball, if a suitor or someone was interested in dancing with you, they would have to write their name on it and kind of schedule their dance time with you for that night. So basically this kind of chantelet would have been worn kind of around the waist. They would have pinned it, and it would kind of sit on the garment like this. And it's a little fun accessory. It's one of my favorite things looking at. And it's a fun kind of highlight from our collection. Okay, our last object that we're going to be looking at is very special. And it is from around 1775. It is Revolutionary War era, and I want to bring it up because essentially this was basically the baseball cap of the Revolutionary War. They were very, very common. And I wanted to show off the box a little bit because I think it's always important to show off a hat box in addition to just the hat, because it does kind of tell a story about the hat itself. And if I open it up, I'm sure you guys can kind of guess what I'm going to be showing you. This is a bicorn. So this was worn during the Revolutionary War. It's made of felt, and it would have been pulled over kind of a hat block, and then it would have been, the felt would have been turned up. It opens up and sits on the head. I'm sure many of you have seen bicorns before. And it features kind of this beautiful metallic braiding around the sides and this little feather in the front. And it is one of the older items in our collection. Very beautiful. I'll show you the back, show you the front, and then I'll put it back down. And that kind of encompasses most of what we are going to be looking at today from our collection here at the Historical Society. So, as you guys know, this is the first in our 3-part lecture series looking at different objects in the collections here. And I really hope you guys enjoyed it and, you know, got some fun information out of being able to see what we have here. And if you have any questions, we're going to open it up and feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
When did women's dresses stop being made separately as bodices and skirts and start being dresses as a whole? Because my understanding was that a lot of time, particularly it made them more adaptable as people grew and shrank with pregnancy and whatever, then things could be more adaptable. When did they start being made as whole dresses rather than a bodice and a skirt?
I think honestly, there wasn't really a time where one was predominant over the other. If we look at kind of the dresses that we were seeing, like the robe à l'anglaise and the robe à la française, which we were looking at the beginning, if you guys can kind of see, this is a bodice with the skirt attached to the back, and then it has an underskirt underneath it down the front here.
Yes.
It's a little hard to tell. So that is kind of a case of it's kind of got a skirt attached to it, and then it's got the separate skirt in the front. Whereas obviously the more empire style were definitely just a solid dress as one piece.
Yeah.
Looking at our collections here, I don't think there was really a specific time when we started separating the skirts from the bodices, because especially during the Victorian era, when we'd start looking at the other dresses I've got over to the side here, there's a pretty even mix of, you know, here's a bodice, here's a skirt. The other thing that's a little bit difficult to disconcern coming from like a historical society collection is that it was very common for people to reuse fabric. So that's kind of one of the biggest losses in collections is we tend to have a lot of standalone bodices, and we don't really know if that bodice had an attached skirt that someone took off, or if it had a separate skirt that would be worn with it. Because if someone has, you know, 5 yards of fabric in a skirt, they're much more likely to reuse that as, you know, a tablecloth or as curtains or something along those lines. Because, you know, for the first 50 or 60 years after the dress is around, people aren't really thinking about like, oh, this is a historical artifact, I should conserve it. So there is definitely kind of a combination of both, I think. Another important thing that I wanted to mention is that a lot of these garments and pieces are photographed and they're on the Madison Historical Society Flickr page that Bob runs, and it's beautiful. And if you want to look at them again, or if you want any more information on them, a lot of them have information underneath. So you should all definitely check that out.
And couldn't help but notice that you're very, very well, you got a wealth of knowledge there, but one thing you didn't point out, or I didn't hear, was that especially when you started talking about the women's fashions in the 18th century, only the wealthy, very wealthy, or nobility wore those clothes. You know, if you were, could you imagine trying to scrub a floor with that stay on? It's just impossible. You wouldn't do it. You couldn't afford it to begin with, right?
That is, yes, that's especially important when we talk about these white gowns that we're looking at. They were very reserved for evening wear and very reserved for wealthy people who could afford to be dressed in white all the time. Because if you're someone working in a field, if you're someone working as a housemaid, you can't afford to be dressed in white all the time because you'll be getting dirty. So that is definitely something that we do want to take note of. The other thing, though, to kind of keep in mind, especially when we're looking at collections items, is the fact that the things that do tend to survive do tend to be kind of the things that belong to the wealthier people, which is unfortunate. However, it is exciting whenever we're going through a collection, looking at pieces in museums and come across something that is kind of worn as everyday wear, especially for someone of the lower class, because they don't tend to get preserved. So it's really cool, and thank you for bringing that up.
Just one other thing too, at the end there, the bicorn. that's really War of 1812. The Revolutionary War and the French and Indian War were all tricolors.
Okay, thank you.
I was wondering what the shoes that you showed us were made of.
The shoes,
Yes,
anyone in particular? Or
uh,
just-
particularly the one with the markings on it, embroidery or paint.
Oh, the embroidery?
Maybe the green ones, I think.
Yes, hold on,
Yeah.
grab my gloves. Yeah, those would have, I actually think all of our shoes right now are made of silk. And then the base kind of heel is made of wood, and it's got kind of a metal bottom to the sole.
I thought it was wood.
Yes. So if you can see,
Yes, I can see. Thank you.
so it's kind of wooden, and then it's got a metal edging around it.
Mhm.
So my question, I was at the Victoria and Albert Museum in England, and they had the painting of a woman in a dress, and they also had the original dress there as well. Okay.
Yeah.
And
I think I know which one you're talking about.
yeah, and the dress was very muted in color, but in the painting of the same dress, it was brilliant red and some other colors. And so, how do you know that the outfits that you have over there are not just badly faded?
Well, in the case of most of our white things, we kind of are able to tell that they were white because they're, okay, let me start over. Okay, so in the case of a red dress, aniline dyes and synthetic dyes, so dyes that would create colors that were really elaborate, like reds and stuff, didn't come about until the 1850s. So because of that, most of the things that were made before that were made using natural dyes. And so we tend to see a lot more muted colors. But as you kind of mentioned, those muted colors a lot of the times can be attributed to the fact that they're aged garments, and things tend to deteriorate. In the case of our white gowns here, though, however, we kind of are able to know that given the kind of context of when these gowns were made, and the style of what was being constructed at the time, is that they would have been created with the intention of being white. This one in particular, there's a chance that it might have yellowed a little bit with age, but I don't think it's like it was like dyed yellow or something. It is now white. Another though important way that you can tell is if you lift collars and you look underneath pieces that might not have gotten sun damaged, might not have gotten kind of deteriorated thanks to lighting or atmosphere or whatever it is that has taken the color away. You're usually able to tell what color the garment originally was. There was a great bodice that I worked on when I was in London from around the 1650s. That it's this gorgeous kind of like robin's egg blue. And when you look at it at first, you're like, oh, it's this beautiful kind of blue color. But then if you open it up and you look on the inside, all the inside, which hasn't had light exposure, is this much darker blue color. So we're able to tell that it was darker color than it actually looks as like a full bodice now. So there's a couple different ways you can tell, but that is definitely something that does happen and is unfortunate, especially if the collection is not, well taken care of. Fortunately, our collections are very well taken care of. I was very impressed by kind of our storage upstairs. So yes. Anyone else?
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
How do you preserve and keep the dresses when they're not in use or on display?
We have preservation boxes that we house most of our dresses in, and then upstairs we have a couple like preservation cabinets that we keep dresses in as well, especially bigger dresses and more like less fragile ones. So those, most of the time our garments are wrapped in conservation paper and then they're put in these boxes and then shelved upstairs. So they've done a very good job of beginning to kind of conserve everything in a very efficient way, which is very admirable.
We're hopeful that maybe next month in June and maybe again in July, we'll be able to have a few people live in the audience if that's something that you're interested in. So if it is, please let me know. You can shoot us an email and say, yes, I would love to be in person. This video is going to be recorded as well, so we will have it if you wanted to share it with anyone. And the other thing I was going to mention is that on Saturday, June 12th, we'll be having an open house. It'll be our first open house since November of 2019. And I think that Tori will have a couple of objects out from the collection that people can look at. Unfortunately, obviously you can't touch, but you can look at them. So again, thank you so much. Thank you, Tori.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next month. Take care.
Thank you so much.